Welcome all to today's lunchtime seminar. My name's Dinesh. I'm in Sociology and Social Policy, and I'll be chairing. As ever, our seminars are sort of wedged between different things. So we have a Sociology and Social Policy board meeting immediately after. So we're going to try and target to finish 5 minutes early today. Sujatha's going to talk for about half an hour, right? And then we'll hopefully have some question time. This is partly to, I guess, to celebrate and mark Sujatha's fabulous new book called Curated Stories. And Sujatha's going to walk through some of the key concepts from that new book today. There was a link to have a look at one of the chapters, but I also yesterday had a look at some of the book, which is available in the library online. So there's an online copy that you can access in the library, and I think it looks wonderful. So I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation. Sujatha has a PhD from the University of Chicago and taught at the City University of New York for a decade, and she's currently a joint appointment between sociology and political economy here at Sydney Uni. Her research combines social theory and political economy with in-depth, engaged ethnography of global social and labour movements. Her latest book, and she's got a number of books now, this is your fourth book, is that correct? Is entitled Curated Stories, The Uses and Misuses of Storytelling, and it's published by Oxford University Press. Thank you, Sujatha.
Okay, thank you so much. And I wish I had a copy of my book here. It was mailed to me last Monday, my author copies, and it's right now on the FedEx truck. So unfortunately, I couldn't bring in a copy with me, but this is the book cover up here. So the contemporary era has seen an emergent culture of storytelling that presents carefully curated narratives with predetermined storylines as a tool of philanthropy, statecraft, and advocacy. Contemporary life is saturated with such initiatives, from the phenomenon of TED Talks and Humans of New York to the plethora of story coaching agencies and strategists that have emerged to sustain this culture. It is no coincidence that the rise of this curated storytelling takes place in an era of Facebook, which a New Yorker article notes is a medium that promotes the quick and cavalier consumption of others. The popular stories in news feeds and timelines of social media are those that are accessible. Histories, ambiguities, and political struggles are erased in an effort to create warm and relatable portraits of others who are just like us. This mode of curated storytelling has extended deep into contemporary social life and political culture and institutions. The Harvard lecturer and political strategist Marshall Gans was called upon in 2007 to provide storytelling workshops for Barack Obama's election campaign, and his public narrative trainings have since been used widely by advocacy organizations, non-profits, NGOs, and immigrant rights groups. Tell your story has become an inspirational mantra of the self-help industry. Narrative research centres have emerged to look at the benefits of storytelling in a range of areas, from treating depression to helping new immigrants build community. Philanthropic organisations and foundations produce storytelling manuals and offer trainings to their grantees in non-profit storytelling. The US Department of Defense sponsors a project known as Narrative Networks, looking at the strategic implications of narrative for defense missions, and the US State Department has used story workshops as a means of cultural diplomacy in places like Afghanistan. What is behind this contemporary boom of instrumental storytelling? What accounts for the wide diffusion of a storytelling model as a set of globally available trainings, toolkits, and protocols? While most of the literature about storytelling has focused on the multiple gains to be had from telling stories, my book, Curated Stories, takes a more critical look at the storytelling boom. Alongside a broader shift to neoliberal and financialized economies, storytelling is being reconfigured on the model of the market to promote entrepreneurial self-making and is leveraged towards strategic and measurable goals driven by philanthropic foundations. Curated personal stories shift the focus away from structurally defined axes of oppression and help to diffuse the confrontational politics of social movements. Under what conditions do stories reproduce dominant relations of power, and when can they be subversive? What are the stakes, and for whom, in the crafting and mobilization of storytelling? Rather than being the magical elixir we imagine, might curated stories actually inhibit social change? My book presents different cases of curated storytelling as used in the online Afghan Women's Writing Project, the AWWP, and the Domestic Workers and Undocumented Student Dreamer legislative campaigns in the United States. These three examples together illustrate some of the ways that storytelling has been reconfigured in a neoliberal era, and more specifically, they present key sites where stories as a form of soft power were deployed in an attempt to absorb and redirect global war opposition, activism among marginal sectors of workers, and a rising migrant rights movement. While these cases are exemplary of the trend I identify, they are not unique, and we could see these dynamics playing out in any number of other sites. These examples provide an opportunity to examine how the varied arenas of online, legal, media, and movement storytelling produce different kinds of narratives and subjectivities, as well as possibilities for critique or outright dissent. The reinvention of storytelling in a contemporary era has required constructing a genealogy of an essentialized universal formula out of what are fairly diverse oral traditions and narrative practices. Scholarly and popular non-fiction works, storytelling manuals, and storytelling strategists often extrapolate from the Western experience to present the idea of storytelling as universal and timeless. Jonathan Gottschall's popular work, The Storytelling Animal, draws on neuroscience and evolutionary biology to prove that the master formula of story, including character, predicament, and attempted extrication, is a fundamental part of human psychology. A storytelling strategy guide for organization similarly asserts that storytelling is hardwired into our brains. Another work of popular nonfiction, Winning the Story Wars by Jonah Sacks, refers to stories as ancient mythological formulas that are deeply ingrained in our DNA. Sacks projects a seamless trajectory from thousands of years old oral traditions of pre-Columbian Americans, ancient Greeks, and Chinese dynasties to what he calls the digital era of social media and digital technology. Scholarly accounts also participate in this reification of a universal storytelling mode. One scholar suggests that all stories, from Hopi creation myths to James Joyce's Ulysses, share a commonly held narrative code. The construction of a genealogy of an essentialized storytelling reduces disparate practices across vast time periods and reifies discourses that are often inseparable from everyday rituals and relationships. Scholarly and popular works attempt to pin down the key elements of a prototypical story. For the narrative psychologist Jerome Bruner, a story includes characters as free agents with expectations about the world, a breach in the expected state of things, efforts by the character to come to terms with that breach, and then a resolution or outcome. Gottschall argues for a universal grammar of stories that is based on trouble as the key ingredient. Sacks similarly asserts that without a conflict there is no story. This construction of a prototypical story formula as based in conflict is highly reductive of the vast oral and narrative practices that it purports to represent. What different people around the world refer to as some sort of story may all look very different from one another. One of the celebrated stories in the Western literary canon, Why Don't You Dance by Raymond Carver, has no plot or conflict. A man sets up his bedroom furniture on the lawn outside his house. A young couple passing by stop and buy some of the items. They all dance. When we look at what constitutes a story outside the West, which is the focus of most sociological studies of storytelling, we see even less adherence to the master formula of story. For example, in the Japanese form Kishotenketsu, there is no recognizable conflict. There is usually a twist sometime late in the story, but the narrative is driven by elements other than conflict. The anticipation of the reader is encouraged less through expectations about future events and more toward an appreciation of the predicament of the current situation. The notion of a prototypical conflict-driven story is a construct which serves to impose order on what is an incoherent, widely divergent set of narrative practices. The construction of a universal mode of conflict-driven stories has emerged alongside the idea that storytelling should be employed to give a voice to those who are marginal, powerless, and silent. Rather than having advocates and others speaking for them, there is a notion that people can now speak for themselves. Personal testimony assumes a privileged relation to the truth because it is spoken by those affected. Afghan women, domestic workers, barrio residents, and undocumented students who narrate their stories are all assumed to be silent, silenced, invisible, and voiceless sectors of society. By learning how to tell their story, it is suggested that they will have a voice. Advocates and story workshop leaders use such terms as coming out of the shadows and coming out from behind the veil. But this claim of invisible and silenced people gaining a voice through stories is itself a rhetorical construction that amplifies some voices at the expense of others. Those who are able to make their personal experiences legible to the mainstream through drawing on dominant narratives and devices are given a platform, while other voices are silenced. The purpose of this construction of storytelling through notions of genealogy, prototype, and voice is to instrumentalize it, even if just to show, as scholars have done, that stories can help sustain human life and humanity, create empathy, mobilize people in support of social change, and share meaning within social movements. In contrast, I do not treat stories and storytelling as predetermined universal categories and objects of analysis, but rather I examine the ways in which genealogies of storytelling, story prototypes, and voice are themselves constructed by different actors. I investigate how people tell stories, what they think stories should be like, and what they propose as prototypical narratives in order to provide insight into the political role of narrative. This involves a close examination of both the story as text and the broader context in which stories are produced. Stories are narrated using different modes, what Alessandro Portelli refers to as the personal, the collective, and the political. The personal storytelling mode includes accounts of private and family life, as well as the life cycle of birth, marriage, children, and death. The collective register encompasses the life of the community and or neighbourhood and can extend to the workplace and collective participation. The political mode refers to global and national historical context and the political sphere. Narrators create coherence in their stories by combining these different levels, but one level is usually dominant. Portelli argues that the shift between these different registers of narration is done strategically by the narrator, depending on what they want to achieve with their narrative. For instance, in his main case of the Italian steelworker Luigi Trastulli, Portelli argues that when describing the contested circumstances surrounding his death, younger political organisers shifted from the political to the personal mode in order to avoid a message of collective powerlessness. Drawing on Portelli's insights, I suggest that the contemporary boom of storytelling in legislative campaigns, cultural diplomacy, and advocacy has involved a shift in emphasis away from the collective and political modes of narration towards the personal mode. Those relating their stories are individuals rather than members of a class or community, and they enter into conflict with individual employers rather than or spouses instead of dominant classes or patriarchal structures. If there is a shift to the political in these stories, it is usually a predetermined slogan or campaign message, and not an interrogation of the structural conditions that shape one's life story. Narrators may avoid giving a political framing to their stories for fear of reprisal or because they are directed away from such framing by legal protocols or advocates. Or they may employ a dominant political framing to protect themselves from more critical implications of the stories that they tell. But when stories shift to include the community or structural political modes, they have the potential to be subversive stories. As Ewick and Silby argue, subversive stories recount political experiences as rooted in and part of an encompassing cultural, material, and political world that extends beyond the local. Through semiotic analysis of discourses, constructs, and modes, we can probe these deeper significations of stories as text. Most of the scholarly and political and popular literature extols the virtues of a prototypical and universal storytelling model, but it does not address the circuits of capital within which stories circulate. In order to describe the remaking of storytelling in a context of neoliberalism, I have developed the concept of the political economy of storytelling. The concept refers to two intertwined activities. The first is the production, circulation, and consumption of stories that are mobilized towards certain utilitarian ends, such as building the political capital of organizations and bolstering electoral goals and the aims of imperial statecraft. Stories are structured through protocols and workshops to provide soundbites that can be easily delivered in a newspaper interview, voter recruitment drive, or legal hearing. Disembedded from the social networks and everyday life of the storyteller, these stories are circulated in legislative and electoral campaigns and online forums. A political economy of storytelling is concerned with the conditions of production of stories within neoliberal orders. The second activity involves the deployment of stories in processes of subject making. Scholars of literature have shown how under liberal modernity the story form provided the technology by which social outsiders acquired the capacity to become citizen subjects. Genres such as autobiography produced modern liberal notions of the self as rational, unitary, and assured of its free agency, with origins in the 18th century Enlightenment and colonial capitalism. Through a process of self-knowledge, the historically marginalised individual moved toward becoming the Enlightenment subject capable of participation in civic life. This teleology of development is apparent in the examples I discuss in this book. However, in a neoliberal era, Nicholas Rose argues that the subjects of rule are specified in a new way, as active individuals asked to enterprise themselves, to maximise their quality of life through acts of choice. The individual is seen injustices faced by domestic workers, invisibility, misrepresentation, and disrespect that the movement sought to challenge by broad dissemination of personal narratives. Over 6 years, the organisation Domestic Workers United, DWU, enlisted a multi-ethnic coalition of organisations in the city to work on a Bill of Rights campaign. As one of the main groups driving the coalition, DWU had an expansive vision of worker rights. In member workshops and trainings, they discussed how the domestic work industry was shaped by class exploitation, racial oppression, and patriarchy. They talked about the main goal of DWU to dismantle systems of oppression such as globalisation and imperialism. At a retreat in February 2004, workshop leaders noted the need to go beyond legislative actions to address the root causes of oppression. DWU sought to locate worker struggles in a larger neoliberal economic system where manufacturing is moved overseas and the conditions are created for migrant workers to be highly exploited. They discussed the need to fight both the state and also multinational corporations who demand profits at any cost. But during the campaign, DWU began to transition away from these structural critiques of global labour exploitation and more toward a movement of workers sharing their stories through lobbying. The stories aim to promote the dignity and recognition of domestic workers, but the constructions of workers in the stories, bound by legislative protocols and geared toward a mainstream audience, reinforced rather than challenged the broader conditions of their work. As the campaign progressed and the organisation received more foundation grants for their legislative work, a wedge was driven between these symbolic struggles for recognition and battles for redistribution of economic resources, with the utopian visions and systemic critiques of the early days being gradually replaced by a more pragmatic approach. In a moment when service-based organisations come to fill the space left by a downsized neoliberal state, those organisations fighting on behalf of domestic workers are compelled to operate as non-profit organisations dependent on foundation funding, rather than as labour-based unions or worker-led social movements. Alongside broader shifts to financialised economies, foundations increasingly base their philanthropy on the model of the market, and they require their grantees to pursue strategic and measurable goals such as legislative victories. One of the main arenas for storytelling during the campaign was the New York State Legislature in Albany. At an Assembly Labour Committee hearing on the conditions surrounding domestic employment in New York, held on November 21, 2008, testimonies by domestic workers, academics, and labour allies were presented. The hearing was a crucial one for the campaign. The general atmosphere of the hearing was sympathetic and open, as the three members of the Assembly present were all supporters of the bill. Domestic workers were given a protocol to follow for submitting their testimonies. The notice stated that oral testimony will be by invitation only and limited to 10 minutes duration. Assemblyman Keith Wright emphasised to the presenters that they were on a very tight schedule and that people would have to stick to the schedule. The domestic workers used the legislative hearing as a site to stage their stories of abuse and mistreatment. Personal stories were highly effective in communicating the conditions of domestic work, even more so than just facts and statistics on violations. A Filipino worker related how her employers accused her of stealing a box of $2 Niagara cornstarch. Another spoke about how her male employer frequently exposed himself to his staff. And one West Indian domestic worker recounted that her employer violently beat her and called her the N-word. But the stories were also strongly circumscribed by the legal hearing itself. The strict time limits of the testimonies and of the hearings themselves often meant that there was little room for the complexity of the women's stories. The protocol at the 2008 Labour Committee hearing required workers to address certain selected issues that fell within narrowly defined boundaries, including typical hours and schedule, benefits, relationship with employer, grievance procedures, and how New York State can improve working conditions. Workers were instructed to focus on the technical conditions of employment rather than the broader structural context of their industry. As a result, the abuses seemed to be the consequence of individual bad employers who could be reined in by tighter regulations, rather than part of an entrenched system of exploitation. While some workers recounted standing up to their employers, most of the stories end with the worker being fired or subject to ongoing harassment. Although several of these cases involved lawsuits against employers or demonstrations and protests outside their home, the stories did not make mention of this fact. For the purposes of the public hearing or press conference, the employers reign supreme in their position of control, while the worker has been taken advantage of. Many of the narratives end with reference to the bill and how this bill will improve their situation, but the stories do not give the satisfaction of seeing the employers made accountable for their acts. Like the adult survivors of child abuse who are required to give performances of fear, grief and shame in court in order to prove victimhood and win compensation, domestic workers were also required to present themselves as victims of unscrupulous employers who get away with exploiting workers. Middle-class campaign leaders channeled the energy of the movement into more limited avenues of legislative reform, trading deeper critique and direct action for higher profile in the media and policy settings. Stories in the media and legal hearings relied on a liberal framing as individual workers exploited by deviant bad employers that dates back to slavery and colonialism. These stories were severed from the root causes of injustice and from strategies to address those causes. By driving a wedge between goals of recognition and redistribution, the campaign did little to change the deeper crisis of care under neoliberalism or the structures of global inequality that underlay the lives of domestic workers. In fact, as the political scientist Joan Tronto has argued, globalization is often seen as a means to resolve existing care crises by providing new sources of caring labour. There was no attempt to challenge the racialised and globalised division of labour that produced migrant and black women as carers for a predominantly white professional middle to upper class. The National Campaign for Development, Relief and Education for Alien Minors, or DREAM Act, presented the case of undocumented minors who had legally attended elementary or high school. But when it came to attending college or finding a job after graduation, they faced the barriers of their undocumented status. Immigrant rights groups argued for the exceptional status of these youth who came to be known as dreamers because they were brought at an age when they couldn't understand the legal ramifications of what they were doing, therefore they could not be held responsible. The category of the dreamer was created in 2001 by immigrant rights organisations such as the National Immigration Law Centre, NILC, the Centre for Community Change, and others. Drafted by NILC, the DREAM Act sought a path to citizenship for undocumented university students and youth engaged in community service. The DREAM Act was first introduced into Congress by the Republican Senator Orrin Hatch on August 1, 2001. Undocumented youth were handpicked by advocacy organisations to tell their stories to Congresspeople and the media. There were certain themes that were emphasised by legislators and echoed in the stories of the youth. The students were always high-achieving, usually valedictorians of their classes, and shown as being of good moral character and hard-working. They were presented as fully assimilated into American culture and society with few ties to their birth countries, as innocent of the crime of illegally entering the United States, which was blamed on their parents, as seeking meritocratic success in line with American values and ideals, and as patriots who were willing to defend America. Although the aim of these narratives was to mark out some immigrants as deserving and worthy of citizenship, the effect was to draw a class distinction between those upwardly mobile, assimilated and self-reliant immigrants whose stories could humanise them, and the anonymous foreign and lower-class undocumented labourers who filled the ranks of an informal and exploited labour force. Despite the support of key Senate and House Democrats throughout the decade of the 2000s, the original DREAM Act failed to pass, as did subsequent DREAM bills, both standalone and in combination with broader legislation. At the same time, in the post-11 climate, where immigration and terrorism were coupled, several repressive immigration bills were passed, leading to an acceleration in deportation rates. In the early period of 2007-2008, Dreamers told their stories in congressional hearings and the media. Congressional hearings are ostensibly sessions where decision-makers seek information and promote discussion about proposed legislation, although the anthropologist Phyllis Chock argues that we can better see them as quasi-rituals, where divisive issues and cross-purposes are brought under control through the use of myths. Like in the case of domestic workers, the stories that were told by undocumented youth were shaped and ordered by such dominant myths as the opportunity myth, the myth of an immigrant America, and the search for freedom and legalization narratives that various scholars have identified. The young people who told their stories to Congress were acting as self-regulating subjects who sought to define themselves as law-abiding and deserving of citizenship. Several undocumented youth told their stories at a congressional hearing before the Immigration Subcommittee on May 18, 2007. The hearing was introduced by California Representative Zoe Lofgren. She framed the students as innocent children who should not be penalised for the unlawful actions of their parents and who should be given a chance to become productive members of the society. After this introduction, the undocumented youth presented their stories and then answered questions from legislators. The first person to present her testimony was the college student Marie Gonzalez. In her introduction, Sheila Jackson Lee, a representative from Texas, presented Gonzalez by listing her civic involvement. She's a member of the National Honor Society, the Foreign Language Club, the tennis team, and the track team. When she gives her testimony, Gonzalez draws on the tropes given by the senators. She emphasizes that her parents had entered the country legally from Costa Rica, but later entered into undocumented status. Upholding the notion of undocumented immigrants as lawbreakers, she states, when they came to the US, they had no intention of breaking the law or of making an exception for themselves. Drawing on nationalist mythologies of the land of the free and the American dream, Gonzalez aligns herself as a patriot who came to America seeking freedoms not available in her home country. Gonzalez relates the battle of her and her family to stay in the country, facing deportations and appearing on national television. She ultimately became a national symbol for the DREAM Act after giving the valedictorian speech at a mock graduation at the DREAM rally in front of the Capitol. Gonzalez emphasizes that despite her Costa Rican birth certificate, she considers her only home to be the United States. She says, "I love this country. Only in America would a person like me have the opportunity to be standing in front of you." Her story follows the conventional script of what Chock calls the myth of opportunity. They are about individuals who arrive in America for betterment, strive in adversity, and put down roots in the country. Opportunity stories are about individual heroes rather than social structures or histories. These kinds of curated narratives presented at congressional hearings were also told to the media and at rallies, collected in numerous books, and featured on the websites of legislative leaders. The stories did not intend to convey the complexity, texture, or ambiguity of the lives of undocumented youth. Rather, they were intended for the purely instrumental goal of winning legislation. On Senator Dick Durbin's website, numerous stories are collated. The stories are framed in the same way as the congressional stories, emphasizing the exceptionality of the youth who will contribute to America and as innocent people who should not be punished for their parents' mistakes. The stories refer to the youth as model Americans, honours students, and valedictorians. They list GPAs, SAT scores, and civic involvement. The stories make a virtue out of the Americanness of the student and their lack of any connection with their home culture. Early Dreamer stories tended to downplay the complex causes of migration, emphasizing the United States as a promised land for migrants escaping violent and impoverished homelands. Ethan Lubeid refers to this narrative of movement from repression to freedom as one that appropriates migrants for foreign policy objectives and reinforces dominant US nationalism and imperialism. There is no reflection on the role of US intervention abroad or global neoliberal policies contributing to the harsh conditions that people may face in their home countries. Rather, America is seen as a benefactor nation that serves as a refuge of freedom for those coming from culturally backward and illiberal nations. In recent years, workers and undocumented students have rejected curated storytelling and have begun to tell more critical, complex, and contextualized stories. By shifting to the structural, political, and collective modes that Portelli has identified, they open the possibility for more subversive stories. At a worker writers event organised by poet and labour activist Mark Nowak at the Penn Workers' Writer Festival in New York City in May 2015, the domestic worker and DW member Christine Lewis shared a poem about her experience as a domestic worker in Manhattan. Actually, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip on to my last one, which is about the dissident dreamers who also began to tell different kinds of stories in their rallies and congresses. In contrast to the heavily scripted congressional stories, the dissident dreamer narratives were more in-depth stories that gave voice to alternative perspectives and histories that had been silenced in earlier dreamer narratives. Dreamer stories were also being expressed in more creative forms, often akin to spoken word poetry or song. A creative project known as Dreamers Adrift put together videos on its website telling stories through music, spoken word, and poetry. One of the videos on the site is a collaboration between two undocumented artists, the poet Yosima Reyes and the visual artist Julio Salgado, entitled The Legalities of Being.
My grandmother has never used the word undocumented.
This is as loud as it gets.
In fact, growing up, she never taught me about limitation. Most of the folks on my block shared a similar experience, so there was no dialogue around our status in this country. We don't know where to get fake MICAs or any other documents needed to work in this country. I never felt alone or depressed. In high school, most of my peers were and continued to be undocumented, so conversations around our status were not important because there was a common understanding this was a simple reality and not our identity. We were more than the lack of a social security number. I'm beginning a conversation with myself about defining my being by laws that can never summarize my existence. I'm thinking about integration and its ongoing trend to be called American. I'm thinking about words like dreamer and illegal, language that is stagnant, that in no way, shape, or form speaks truth about the complexities of being and the connections that we have as humans beyond borders and political systems. It is like defining your being by building fences, telling folks this is me, read the sign. I know the importance of visibility and empowering folks to no longer feel ashamed or embarrassed about their status, but as a person who was taught that el pájaro donde quiera es verde, I'm beginning to question these myths I have learned about my homeland. I'm beginning to address this fear that I have about one day potentially returning to that place that gave birth to me. Why is it that every time I think about my home, my heart stops at the idea of living in poverty, when in reality, I have been living below the poverty line my whole life? There's a social construction in my head that America is better, that America will grant me freedom, that America will grant me proper education, that America is a place of justice, when the reality is that I have never seen the fruit of any of these promises. We're still at the same place since we arrived, under attack, caged, profiled, and subjugated to unjust laws. I'm thinking about how damaging it is to label my spirit, my essence, undocumented, taking something so minimal from the physical world and have it manifest in my body. Right now there is a confusion all around me. There is a national campaign to pass the DREAM Act. Obama passed his Deferred Action Plan. Folks are constantly inviting me to speak about my experience. I cannot help but feel bamboozled. There's a trend of folks writing about us, documenting us, wanting to hear us, wanting us to come out of the shadows, wanting us to feel empowered, but for some reason I cannot seem to get past the fact that we're still not addressing our emotional well-being. Not as undocumented people, but as migrants, displaced people, folks whose hearts have been broken by America's lies. Abuelita's heart is broken. Ella no tiene la lengua para explicarle al presidente de sus milpas de café. She is not a dreamer. There is no deferred action for her, no immigration reform for her. She will never be American. One day she will pack her bags, purchase a plane ticket and return home. She will look at the streets, try to remember how things used to be, but time has not passed since she left. Her comadres have passed. Su casita fell. She will look at the dirt, try to remember where she gave birth to her firstborn. Look at the face of a son she has not seen in decades. She will be weak, spending her days remembering. Abuelita will slowly dig her grave, fall back into the land that brought her to this journey, return to the center and migrate to the spirit world. There, she will no longer need papers, no longer be poor, no longer ache, no longer be broken-hearted. There, she will whisper to me and remind me that all this is a dream, that one day we will wake up to a place more beautiful than this.
So while the dreamers hold up visibility as one of the key goals of their movement, Ray's, his grandmother, and his friends on the block have no wish to make themselves legible within this dominant order. Ray's questions the myths he has been made to believe about his homeland and the illusion of America as a place of freedom and justice that will grant him a proper education. He shifts into Spanish, emphasizing the non-translatability and illegibility of his grandmother's experiences into the dominant dreamer discourse. Ray's grandmother's story becomes a reflection on the alternative migrant experience as one who is not striving for social mobility and assimilation into middle-class American life, but rather yearns for her homeland. So in conclusion, in order to produce different kinds of tropes, subjectivities, storylines, and narratives, new kinds of organising are necessary to open the spaces for those. Without broader social movements, we will be constrained to stories that conform to what is acceptable in the narrow vision of the mainstream. In recent years, we've seen rounds of global uprisings, from the Arab and North African revolts and Occupy Wall Street movements in 2011 to direct democracy movements in Spain and Greece, and the Black Lives Matter movement and the growing anti-fascist movement in the US today. Occupy Wall Street popularized a narrative of the 99% and the 1%, a narrative which has reshaped people's perceptions of wealth, social inequality, and social redistribution in broad-ranging ways. The Black Lives Matter movement has made available languages for talking about race, white supremacy, and state violence that did not exist prior. Collective grassroots, and global social movement organizing is the key for shifting from the terrain of the probable, in which much of non-profit and development work takes place, to the terrain of the utopian, where we can start imagining a fundamental restructuring of work, reproduction, and the global economy. it is only with a resurgence of interlocking movements in a range of areas that there can be a move from curated stories to mobilizing stories that deepen the work of social justice organizing. Thank you.
So I think we've got about 10 or 12 minutes for questions. Does anyone want to open things up?
Yeah, so when you were talking about that, I was thinking about the new social impact criteria for the next era, and how that includes a kind of storytelling component. And I was kind of wondering, is it the case that, like, where is the demand coming from? Is it from these kind of non-profit organizations or philanthropic institutions? Is like storytelling a new kind of metric for the social? I mean, I had a glimpse of that in what you were saying. There's a demand for it, and I wasn't quite sure where it was coming from.
Yeah. So I had a chapter on that in the book, which actually sort of looks at how storytelling is seen as a metric itself, and so there's this whole sort of shift with the sort of auditing functions required of NGOs. So it's sort of like, my argument in the book is that as we sort of shift into this neoliberal era with market sort of style regulations regulating everything that happens, including regulating how foundations work, how they allocate their funds, how they decide and can show measurable progress in order to show back to the grantees and get their grants, that storytelling is increasingly being used to show you can demonstrate social impact through stories. And so people are collecting data on, say UNDP and all of these kind of organisations are collecting data on the results of their programs by asking people, upload your story here, tell us how the wood stove worked for you, tell us how this happens. And so in a lot of these grant reports you actually see this language where people say, storytelling is our new metric. It's the new way that we have of collecting information on such a sort of wide scale and then submitting that to the grant, the funder.
We've got actually four people have their hands up. I'm wondering, would you be willing to take four questions?
No problem. We turn the heat down.
I've just turned it down,
Thanks.
Maybe Nick can...
So I'll get
right in the window.
Oh, sorry, yeah, absolutely.
So I'll get the four of you to say questions and
Sure.
I really enjoyed your talk. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'm still processing it, so I'm just sort of thinking through my question as I ask it. But what you're saying about curated storytelling is really interesting, the way it's sort of commodified and made sort of instrumental rational in a quite self-reflexive, deliberative way. Were you then contrasting that mode of storytelling with more collectivist modes of storytelling, and is that still to be distinguished from other modes of analysis which might depart somewhat from a kind of narrative mode, that are less focused on the construal of actants and these sorts of features which we typically associate with a story? So I guess I'm asking do some of the concerns you have about curated stories at a personal level, does that extend to other political narratives which claim to speak for a collective but could just as easily be framed in a kind of imaginary register and a mythic kind of register? And so do you think we should have the same concerns there? And is there still a distinction to be made between those sort of that political mode of narrative understanding and a more analytical register, which might be different again from a narrative mode?
Yeah, could I actually jump in because it might be hard for me to remember. So the argument I'm sort of making is that not even really curated stories, I'm not necessarily looking at as commodified stories, because I think with curated stories we've even moved beyond stories as a commodity, which is definitely something that I think has happened and that we've seen. But moving beyond stories as a commodity is to look at the ways in which they've become instrumentalized in service of narrow goals. And I think that's the difference I see to, like, I sort of compare it to an earlier period, which is, say, the radical social movements of the 60s and 70s. So the women's movement, the Black Power movement, a lot of these movements use stories, but they also use them in instrumental ways, but they use them in order to point to larger structures. And so when the women's movement did consciousness raising, and when they talked about say domestic violence, they would relate it back to questions of patriarchy, or they would include discussions of the broader context, and that's what, sort of argue made these stories more radical. But in this sort of shift, what we've seen is that those political and collective ones have dropped out. Now, your question about political narratives, I think, is a good one, and I talk in the book about these training workshops that were carried out in 2008 during the Obama campaign in the US, where Marshall Gans, who is this a lecturer and somebody who was employed by the Obama campaign, sort of came up with this whole thing, and some of you may have heard of it because it's very widely used in a lot of different places, called Story of Self, Us and Now. And it was, you come up with the story of yourself, it has to be a 2-minute story, and then in that story of self you relate it to the present moment and you relate it to the collective. And in the collective they're talking about either the family or the nation. And the ultimate aim of this was to elect Obama. So it was very sort of instrumental, short-term, go out, tell your story, recruit voters, get Obama elected kind of thing. And the sort of difference I talk in the book between those collective narratives, where they had the story of us and the story of now and relating it to the political collectivity, was that it still wasn't talking about the broader structures, right? It wasn't talking about the situation. So people might tell stories about, a young black woman who wanted to be an astronaut and couldn't study, and she couldn't even get able to go to college, and so she was one of the people who told her story. But we don't really get a sense of why. What are the structures of race in America that would lead to something like that? We just get the quick 2-minute story and then vote for Obama, things will get better kind of thing. So, yeah.
Okay, Danny, Sahun, and this one at the back.
Rafi.
Okay, could I get you three to...
Together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have 2 questions that I'll just ask you. One that really picks up on what Melinda was asking, because I'm very sympathetic to the narrative that you're telling about structure dropping out of stories. But I think that there's a third term, I'm just wondering the way you place that, which is quantification of reality. So I would say that the ability to tell a story in an impact evaluation of a development project, for example, or about our own work, it could be framed as a response to a structural analysis of injustice, or it could be framed as an alternative to the quantification of how many wells were dug in the community. When actually having people talk about what that did in their lives gives you a whole much more nuanced set of insights into what was going on.
Yeah.
So I just wondered where you placed that in your map.
Yeah. And so in the actual examples that I give, like for instance in the domestic worker stories, I think that's completely valid and relevant. So that the domestic workers being at the legislator and being at, sorry, I was supposed to wait 3 people, I'll be quick. And so the domestic workers actually being there and presenting their stories was seen as giving a human face and a much more sort of empathetic way to frame the problem than if somebody had just gone up and said, there are this many violations in the industry and ABC, and given like a whole number of statistics, that this had a much more emotional impact. And I agree with that. I think that's right. I think that's true. But I think we can also look at how some stories, in addition to providing that kind of emotional immediacy and drawing people in and encouraging empathy, can also stop our reaction at a certain point and not take it further by the ways in which it may simply say, you can resolve this by giving money to X, or you can resolve this. It makes people think that they're absolved if they simply like put a like on Facebook, or they pay this money, or they share a GoFundMe or something.
Thank you. And the case that I had in the back of my mind while listening to your talk was this perpetual sort of Australian PR rejection on the basis of disability of their family members, where these typically doctors and very successful people argue that they're bringing in more benefit to Australia than what they're extracting, and how it's extremely individualized stories of punching in the calculator and saying stuff like, I have Bupa, so it won't be a burden to the Australian state. And the similarities between the stories that you tell and the stories that I've heard, which are very individual, sort of personal, petition-based on change.org kind of approach. And the relationship between personal and the collective in this case is, highly sort of segmented temporary migrants, because the Australian temporary migrant movement isn't the same as in the US. But in your case, sort of de-collectivizing impact of this selected successful stories that lead people to just accept some form of dream and not the other. But it led me to think, and this comes up later in your presentation about eligibility, and this inherent power dynamics that presents itself in people accepting some kind of story and not the other. And I was just wondering so then what kind of dynamics are we talking? Who's regarding what certain stories are legible and not legible in other cases? Are we talking, because we, not like in Australia, in the States, you have an act, right? Actual act which you think benefits a wider population.
Can we just go to this question?
Thanks so much for your talk. I was really interested in it both because part of my research on community organisations was how they use kind of client stories, but also I used to work in communications in trade union, NGO, and the political party. And I wanted to ask, did you look much at like how this kind of move towards curated storytelling has created a kind of professional class of especially young people who kind of get employed on that basis? So, especially a lot of people I know that, did journalism or communications degrees, there are no jobs in those kind of in journalism anymore, so they have to work in kind of these non-profit sector communications roles. And so without the kind of curated storytelling, they'll actually be put out of work. I was wondering if you come to that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I didn't look at that specifically, but definitely one of the things that interested me is how so many of these kind of non-profits and social movement organisations and others hire people to coach them in storytelling. They run workshops in storytelling, or they hire, and often the people who they hire are like professional PR consultant type people who have training in doing PR, and so that itself lends another whole layer to the work that they're doing. And in some ways, sort of that shift that I described with Domestic Workers United, from they went to themselves sitting down and talking about things like the global labour industry and how that shapes their work, and how the issue is not just getting a package of laws that's going to protect them, but how it's actually more broadly thinking about, the reasons why do people migrate here in the first place, asking those bigger questions. But when you have somebody who's got a degree and comes in and they sit there and tell the room, okay, so now everybody, how are you going to in 2 minutes tell your story in a way that's going to convince a legislator? There's no room in that 2-minute story. And in fact, I didn't present it here, but in the book, in that chapter, there is a couple of examples of people who wanted to tell that story regardless of the fact that that didn't fit in the protocol and that there wasn't any time in the assembly hearing, but they nevertheless wanted to tell the stories of how this is not us as individuals, this is not me and my individual employer, this is a broader system, and if we don't look at this broader system, and so you actually, in the transcripts of the 400 pages or something transcripts of these hearings, you find a few stories here and there where people are willing to speak to that, but it's sort of not the majority. And on the question also about some stories being legible and some stories not being legible, I think what I sort of found was that it is these sort of very individual type stories that present sort of very kind of narrow views of who is to blame, of who is how we can resolve this through some kind of legal strategy often, or through voting for somebody who's going to change the laws and will therefore make things better. These are the stories that sort of seem to resonate. I'm just talking about the cases that I looked at in my book. And so, for instance, the story told here, the one that I played, is one that is not a story that is seen as legible or in that more sort of so for instance, in those early Dreamer congressional hearings, people were specifically told, don't mention your parents, don't mention, any kind of drug activity, don't mention any kind of gang involvement, don't mention anything like that, because you have to make yourself out to appear blameless. And so there was always the good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative that I think, you were giving the example of doctors who are sort of trying to come here and do their individual story, and that's been something, like even in the US, from refugee stories, from people who tell their stories, they always have to tell particular kinds of stories that are going to mean that they can be accepted and that they can come here, and it has to be one that takes away all blemish from their, and all fault from them, and makes them just seem as sort of, people who just want to come to this new country.
I'm going to have to call it to a close there. Thank you so much, Sujatha.
Thanks, everyone.